I'm going to start this off looking at writing files. So this is still on page 47 again if you're following along. So writing tables to a file, there are several arguments and we're going to look at the basic ones. So we'll just write table, and what shall we write? Trying to see what we have. We should, let me check this out. What do I have in X? Okay, so we have one that the test one that I was working with before. Let's say that we want to write that one to file, and let's see if this is still where I want to send it to. This is output files, give it a folder with my name, and I'll put today's date on there. Let's see. So parameters, writing it, there won't be any quotes in this one, but I'll go ahead and get in the habit of telling it that it's false. And I'm just looking up to see. So the way that he explains it is that this argument specifies whether you want factor levels within double quotes, and that it's not particularly helpful when editing spreadsheets. I know that I won't be using it here, so anyway, I will leave it at that. Since I read it in, suppose that I were reading it in to work with it and I wanted to send it back to a file, whether it was the same one or a new one. This one is a new one. With tab delimiters, I'm going to write it with tab delimiters, and row.names, there's an S on there, equals false. So since we just looked at S, we read it in with no row names, so we want it to write it back with no row names. Now this is where it's a little bit interesting, because if we had read it in differently, then we would have to write it back differently. And let me check what weird, it looks like it's looking for another argument. Why is it looking for more of an argument? Row dot names equals false. Oh, this is worthwhile noting. I left off the T, and I guess it's one of the useful things of RStudio is just a little bit of green. You could tell that something was not quite right. Okay, we need to get it to finish that one, running that one line, and let's try to run it again. The quickest way to see exactly how it wrote is to open up the file. So I already have this open here. This is the one we just wrote. So that looks exactly the same way as it was originally, which is what we want. So it has the headers and then it has each of them. Just to double check and say, okay, well, would it look the same in the Excel, which is how we created it? We could go to here and say this one was, let's see, this one was 2 that we were working on originally, and oh, I have it in output files. It's where this one is. And this is the one we just wrote. So coming back to here, that's what we just wrote, and that's with the parameter file names. So since part of what I'm working on is to be certain that how I'm reading it in a file and working with it, that I can write it back and know what I'm writing back exactly, with the parameters and the arguments that I'm using, even when the file is too big and I don't want to worry about messing it up. The other way that I'd written it in was in this version where I use the row names. So it's worth noting here that when I used it as a row name, that the column header for that disappeared. And so what I've seen as I'm writing this is that the same thing happens when I write it back. So if I write it back, let's call this one, we'll call it, I think he's doing the same thing in the book, so we'll call it B. And to, let's see, so to put the row name back into one of the columns as we're writing it, we actually have to say column name and say that it's not applicable. And then we write that, and B is the one that we just wrote, and then we can see that it's almost the same except our one column header is gone. So that's worth noting, that I think it's significant both reading it in and then planning to write it back out, whether we want to be able to keep that. So that we can see what also happens if we change and make the row names true when we wrote it in a different way. I'm going to change just that one part and say, all right, let's say the row name is true. So this is with X. Let's look at X again, how it is in R. So we see that it's numbered. Say we forgot that we did it that way and instead wrote it back and said row names is true. Let's see how that would write it. Oh, I want to keep the first one, and we're going to write this to, I'm going to write this to another one, call it AA. Run that. So if the row names are true, then that seems to be what it's doing, is saying that this is actually a row, and so it started this as the column name for row 1, and we end up with everything shifted over. So then at this point everything would be mislabeled, and our final one would have no column name. And just to see also what would happen with our second one, so we have X2 here. This is where we called these as our row name. If we had forgotten to say column names is NA, suppose we had left this as row. We'll try this once as false and once as true. And guess for a minute. If you're taking this table and you say that the row names is false, so there's no row names, you can guess what would happen. Let's take a look. Oh, I didn't run them. All right, so we'll run this, run this. So the first one, row names is false. So the row names was false, so it acted as though those were numbering essentially and just took them off. So they've all disappeared. Let's look at the other one. So it said row names is true. So we're saying those are row names. But we said nothing about the column names. So essentially it looks like it didn't hold the columns, but then shifted them all over. So what would have matched up here and here and here no longer match, and we have an empty one. So in order to get what we actually wanted, that's the column names, and A is what held the columns, I don't know, kind of static, so to speak, and gave the this into its own column. But since we had read them in, we already lost the column name for it. So if we wanted to have all those column headers, then we would have wanted to do that as we read it in so that we could have it back when we wrote it out. And that's where we'll leave off on the writing tables.